Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today I've got Marco and Richard and Michael with me. So today we're not doing the most cheery of topics, but we never do cheery topics on the channel recently, I guess, because the conflict is depressing, but it's important to talk about. We're talking about a conference that took place in the last few days in Michigan, in the United States, and this was the People's Conference for Palestine. Now, it's understandable, I guess, if people haven't heard too much about this conference, if you don't keep up with these kind of things. But I think this conference is important to look at because whilst for many people in the West, the conflict only really comes to mind when violence breaks out. They're interested in it for a couple of months and then they lose interest. It may as well not exist in their minds. A lot of the conflict, a lot of the actual battle lines, if you like, are actually advanced, I think, in academic spheres, at conferences, in papers, in classrooms, that kind of thing. And it's important to look at what these people are saying and what they're advancing to really get the measure of the pro-Palestinian movement. And actually looking at this conference, it isn't just a kind of measured kind of conference where the speakers are disguising what they're saying in kind of nice terms, just wanting to advance freedom. This is an openly pro-terrorist, I think you have to understand it, conference, a pro-Hamas conference, where there were speakers from the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The keynote speaker was the wife of a dead terrorist, all this kind of stuff. So this is important to look at, and we're going to have a look at this today, have a look at what they were saying, some of the key ideas being explored, and what they were advocating for. So Mark and Richard, why don't you start us off and just give us your impression of it and some of the key things you took away from it?
Yes. First of all, every time I see the word people in front of anything, I'm already on high alert because that to me suggests Marxism, People Republic, People's Bank, people whatever. But it's quite interesting how ideas don't tend to change across time, while fashion does. These people 100 years ago would have been wearing brown shirts, while now they're wearing terrorist kitchen towels. And they indulge in the usual Palestinian bingo with words like cleansing, occupation, imperialism, apartheid, genocide, Palestinian struggle. And the purpose, really, they admit it quite clearly, is to create this movement, which they call global solidarity. What does it mean? It's actually an organized form of terrorism, which includes, which is disguised as protest, but includes disruption, bullying, and intimidation. So much so that they organized an event early in June in order to effectively intimidate the people inside the White House to give in to their demands. And their demands are hardly rational because, as you mentioned, they are pro-terrorist people. They don't disguise it. It's quite obvious. Just look at the audience. I mean, we had the terrible idea of watching some of the videos that these people put out. And, you can see on the panel people they don't wear the terrorist garbs of Hamas anyway, but you also see people on the panel, women especially, with a symbol of Islamic women oppression, wearing the scarves and all this kind of stuff. And it doesn't really work very well when you're then trying to promote an ideology and a government, a dictatorship, which is oppressing. It's an oppressive regime. So to argue for slavery as you're wearing the slaves' garbs, it's not very, very effective in my mind.
When you look at the audience, it's made up typically of the standard, it's made up of Muslims and it's made up of lefties. Those are the two that are combined, each of them, of course, wearing the keffiyeh, as Marco pointed out there. All of this happens under a big banner of a whole group of organizations. There's lots and lots of organizations that endorse this thing. In fact, when I looked at their website and looked at who endorses them, there's literally hundreds of the things. I didn't get past the A's, to be honest. But here's 4 A's to give you an example of the kind of people we're talking about. And it includes all sorts of areas. So, for example, one was called Animal Rights for Palestine. Whether they're against halal or not, I don't know. There's All African People's Revolutionary Party. There was the Artivists, presumably a conflation of art and activists. Artivists of Iowa, for example, and one which, from an objective objectivist point of view leapt off the page to me, one called Atlas of Blackness. And all of these bodies, and all of the other ones that we've heard of all the time, all with Palestine in their name as well, of course, they're all coming together under this banner to act for what is really Marxism, plain and simple. I mean, on the website of the main guy who we saw giving one of the talks, it sets out his agenda for his organization. And his organization is quite clear in its agenda, to be honest, in the name of it. It's the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And this is one couple of sentences out of their mission statement. We are united in our belief that capitalism is the source of the main problems confronting humanity. It must be replaced by socialism. Our mission is to link the everyday struggles of opposition and exploited people to the fight for a new world. I mean, that lays out very clearly what they're after. This is an organization that's run by people who were fighting Vietnam, the Vietnam War back in the 70s. It's people who have been fighting the system for decades, teaching the new Che Guevara wearing T-shirt equivalents in the audience to fight today for the same ultimate goal.
Michael?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, when I was younger, I heard about the Democratic Republic Peoples of Congo, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. And my initial thing, being a young person, somewhat naive and believing words, was that this was a great place. Now, we all know that the Democratic Republic of Congo, just like the North Korea, which has democratic in its title also, and as did some of the worst parts of Germany at times, we know that this is some of the most despotic, despicable places on earth. And what is shocking, as you said, was that we enjoy making the same mistakes over and over again. And I bring it back to two groups of people. I think fundamentally our teachers and our professors are teaching the wrong stuff. And a lot of them are supporting this crap. And it is, and by the way, they're all funded by taxpayers, which don't exist in socialism. We'll put that aside for later. And then our leadership in the West has completely gone morally bankrupt, completely. There are so few Western leaders who will take an affirmative stand and just say it like it is. We all know that the world is only making progress because of capitalism, that our greatest discoveries and wealth and betterment of humanity is because of capitalism. And nobody can point yet to a socialist country that has been successful. Sure, if you discover oil in your backyard, you can become socialist, meaning 10% of your population gets a heck of a lot of money and the rest get whatever's left over, but it's so much money, and if you wait long enough oil comes out, you can, that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about taking earth, wind, fire, and water, to go back to the primary elements, and creating a civilization out of it, which is what happened in the United States, which is what happened in Israel, which is what happened in a lot of Western Europe. And we don't have the teachers teaching that. In fact, they are ignoring facts. And this is essentially all the humanities departments. Almost every humanities department in the country, in America at least, is not teaching facts. They don't even teach 9/11 in most places anymore in America because we don't want to offend the Muslims. You don't teach the Holocaust because it offends German people. We shouldn't teach about when the Ottoman Empire, the Turks took over, because that would piss people off. So all of this stuff that we're seeing, and I would caution us not to get too caught up on the details, are horrendous, but it comes from fundamental moral bankruptcy and ignoring facts. And we all know that when you ignore facts, you end up with death. When you have an engineer that ignores facts, bridges collapse, buildings collapse. When a doctor ignores facts, patients die. For some reason, the humanities believe that you can somehow rewrite history, close your eyes, pretend socialism is a viable alternative to anything. Point out one example, or Islamic fundamentalism for that matter. Let's find a good Islamic fundamentalist country in the world. Tell me one where women and gays have equal rights, or even close to equal rights. Can't do it. So I look at all this and it depresses me, but I'm a little bit cynical about it, because what did we expect?
Absolutely. And I think it's important for people to realize this conference wasn't or isn't fringe. If you go look at any of the live streams they put up, I don't recommend you do it unless you have a strong stomach. But the crowd is literally of hundreds of people. This isn't one of the ones where kind of most of the chairs are empty and there are just some people dotted around. This is very, very well attended. And even one of the people who made a kind of surprise appearance at the conference and wasn't listed, I don't think, as one of the main keynote speakers was Rashida Tlaib, who is, of course, a very notable politician in the US. And it was notable that one of the speakers who I saw opening one of their live streams was saying it's no accident that we've decided to host this in Michigan. We're hosting it in Michigan because this is the largest concentration of the Arab diaspora in the United States. And the way in which in the run up to the election in November, very clearly there has been a need for Joe Biden to appeal to this electorate has been disgraceful. Now, it might be a fact that that to get in, he needs to appeal to it, but the appeal to it, given that this seems to be a predominant kind of attitude amongst that population, suggests a very malign influence in the election, which would be shifting his policy and his messaging around Israel. We've seen him walk not even a wobbly line, a very anti-Israel line. Of course, to the pro-Palestinian people, they think it's far too pro-Israel, except his message is nothing of the sort. And so much of what has come across has undermined Israel and undermined them in their hour of need to defend themselves. Now, to give people a flavor of the kind of thing that they're saying, I just want to read this small part from their closing statement. So they say, "But brothers and sisters, do not let the occupation's rage and blind destruction distract you from the absolute truth. The truth is that there are no bombs strong enough, no fires hot enough, no prison brutal enough to destroy the spirit of the Palestinian people. We are not a people that can ever be destroyed. The occupation does not know that for the Palestinian people, the dead becomes the martyr, the prison becomes the teacher, the besieged becomes the free," and so on. And they go on to say that victory is just on the horizon. But something that's very notable amongst a lot of what they're saying is that this, as I said before, this isn't the kind of disguised rhetoric that you sometimes see at the kind of pro-Palestinian events or causes. There's an open praising of martyrdom, and there were terrorists who came and speak. There's the wife of a terrorist who came to speak. I don't doubt that the reason they called it the People's Conference for Palestine is to echo the name of the group that the terrorists are from, which is for the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is one of the kind of more secondary terrorist groups in Gaza alongside Hamas. So when we say in the title that this is a pro-Hamas conference, I mean, it isn't just pro-Hamas, it's pro-terrorism, really, and using violence as a means to advance your goals. One of the videos they put up was about the student protests on Western campuses, but particularly in the US, and they called it the student intifada. So I think what people, especially people who think that the Palestinian cause is a cause for peace or freedom, is to look at these people and to see that they're openly praising the use of violence as a way of advancing their goals. And there is no desire for peace here. If you're their enemy, if you're the Zionist occupation, as they refer to Israel, I didn't even see them ever refer to Israel as Israel. It was always just the Zionists or the Zionist occupation. They want to use force against you. They might try and lobby governmental coercion to go against you sometimes, which often gets called peaceful means. But they'll use violence when they can. They want to openly intimidate you, as the students did on the campuses, to achieve what they want. And so they're playing for keeps. And so there's no way that people can just look at these kind of conferences or look at this movement and conclude that any of what they are is in favor of freedom and peaceful coexistence, because it's very much not what they want. Marco, Richard?
Yeah, and that's the essence of the point, that these things, just look at what they say, listen to what they say, read what they write about it. All it is, it's nothing to do with peace, nothing to do with reducing the suffering of the Palestinian people, wherever they are. It's all about if they were in favor of peace or stopping the war, they would argue that. At least they would mention a couple of times, wouldn't they? But they don't. All they say, we're going to use violence in order to force Biden to stop arming Israel, and they're going to do that by literally. They want to create a cordon around the White House, and they're going to be dressed in red just to mention remind Biden about the red lines that he mentioned about, but Democrats don't know about red lines. They must be colorblind or something. And then, do they want to help needy people? No, because do they care about the poor people who have been kidnapped by the Houthis, who are just guilty of being the crew of a passing by ship? No, they don't care about those. Do they care about the hostages currently held by their friends in Gaza right now? No, they clearly don't care about that. All it is effectively a massive anti-Semitic grouping. It's kind of support group, a psychological support group for anti-Semites, really. And it's quite incredible looking at them. It looks like a scene from the Planet of the Apes, really, when you see them chanting. And there's some guy, a bunch of nobodies who are given the task to arouse the crowd before the main acts come on stage, and they're all chanting this kind of really pathetic little. They chant them high of the power that they probably feel at the moment, which must be quite a change from the usual state of fear and ignorance that they normally live in. Because they're probably drowning their own irrationality. But the crowds, what do? They chant back like good trained monkeys. It's a sad state of affair just looking at them.
And some of those includes the standard chants we've seen at lots of the student marches, the "there is only one solution" chant, the "Free Palestine" chant, and of course the chant that's in every lefty gathering from the dawn of time, the united, "we will never be defeated" chant. And to be honest, a lot of the time I felt I was looking at like a Labour Party conference, but when seeing the people on the stage, they're kind of people that address a room as conference, as if they're talking to one collective mind by lumping everybody together or speaking about comrades or stuff. It certainly looked very much like the same atmosphere where they've whipped themselves up into thinking that everybody thinks of one mind. And they're all together in it. In fact, they refer to it in some of their literature as a grassroots popular consciousness, and that is what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to think for yourself. You're just supposed to abdicate your own brain to sign here and join up as one cog in a giant machine and change the world that way, it would seem. And just as an aside on the point that Michael made about the titles of countries, I can't help but note again how many times that in the West, you never hear the full name for Iran. You never hear the Islamic Republic of Iran. You just hear it shortened to Iran because that is something that really drives home that it is a theocracy and of course what its intent is geopolitically as well in the region. I think what was noticeable about the conference, some of the titles in it tell you a lot of the sessions that they ran, tell you a lot about what they're concerned about and what their focus is on. For example, there was one of them was called "How Do Movements Achieve Transformation?" So that's an all-catch term. There's one called "Every Time the Media Lies." Now they talk about the Zionist media. To be honest, certainly here in the UK and for virtually every media I see, they're simply parroting Hamas numbers anyway. So how on earth that can be deemed Zionist, I don't know. But of course, they've got sessions on Zionism and US imperialism. And of course, one that I thought was particularly interesting, which was uncommitted votes and the fracturing of the two-party system. And a lot of their focus is on the fact that Democrats haven't represented the opinion that they share at the moment. They're obviously annoyed with Biden. They're fed up with hearing the argument from the Democrats that if you don't vote for Democrat, you'll get Trump. They don't like Trump either, but they are constantly making the point that we just need to stand up for Palestine and essentially America doesn't matter. And we'll find a way of changing the system if we have to.
Michael?
Yeah, what's also shocking to me is when you go to a lawyer and he's giving you personal advice about your situation, you generally listen to them. You pay them money, you take their professional advice, and you listen to them. When you talk to most adults, the general idea is that when they're adults, their ideas, what they say is actually represented what they actually believe and the way they will act. And I've said this before on the show. These are the people that are chanting death to America. These are the people that are talking about changing the system. They're not going to create an alternative system that is going to flourish and employ people. They are going to make a system, as was done in Gaza and is done in many countries that have failed, that is going to destroy what exists and reduce most of the population to poverty, which is what has happened time and again in our world. And of course, these people that are all worried about the common folks in the world and the downtrodden and oppressed, you don't ever hear about them. Never mind how they treat women in LGBTQ, et cetera. But we in America don't want to listen to them. Even our news, even on some of the more conservative news programs, we don't usually get into, let's be directly translating, death to America, death to Israel means that. These are people that believe in death to America, death to Israel. Surely there must be someone who has the balls, for lack of a better term, to stand up to them. And for a leader to actually get up there and say, we do not stand for that. Now, I suspect that most of the American military, and I suspect that frankly, most Americans really don't want to put up with this. They are sick and tired of hearing it. They don't trust these people. They understand that they are basically suicidal maniacs who want to destroy everything good and replace it with these virtuous leaders that somehow exist. They must not be human, because we've never seen a virtuous leader such as they propose to run this socialist paradise that they envision. And we don't want it, but we are not standing up for it. At least in America we're not, and I don't think in Western Europe we are. Now, Israel is standing up for it to an extent, but Israel makes, in my opinion, a huge mistake of getting into detailed discussions, defending and feeling bad. So Israel takes out 2 major generals from Hamas. 54 people get killed, or it was 45 initially, or 35, and now it's 54, whatever. And it's Israel's fault, because Israel should be the only army in the history of humanity that should have laser-guided precision, single-kill munitions. That's basically what the world is saying. Okay? And then we find out a few days later, big shock, that it was actually an illegal Hamas weapons storage area, probably in a Jeep and so on, that ignited because of this and blew up and killed a bunch of people. Again, this is how many times we've heard this same story. And my point of going into all this is that we have so much background chatter, and then we have these despicable people who have been given tacitly, under the guise of free speech, tacitly given a stage to espouse these destructive, suicidal beliefs. And I would love them to have it. Send them over to Boko Haram. Send them to Yemen. Send them to Sudan. Send them to Syria. Let them have it. Let them go to Gaza. They can help rebuild Gaza into their paradise, but not on my tax dollars. And we really have got to stop pretending that these adults are just children and they don't understand. And by the way, Talib and all of the other people in the squad were cheering on 9/11. Now, I understand that Trump has said that, and it was horrendous when he said it, and nobody really believed it. Well, guess what, guys? They're saying it now. They may not be saying it directly, but they are saying it. And there are a group of Democrats, which Biden is not condoning, that really do not want this country to continue on its current path. And it is shocking. And it frankly is shocking that we, as the contributors to this country and the success and our tax dollars to support a lot of these people and sure pay their salaries, the leaders' salaries, we put up with it. So I know I got off the topic a little bit, but I think you got to look at the bigger picture here to try to understand where's this coming from and how do we fix it.
So we have a few super chats. So John Komatsu gives $5, thank you, and says, terrorist kitchen towels. Marco, that deserves a super chat. So there you go. Thank you, John. PC gives £5 and says, I keep seeing Marxist posters in London. I keep removing them. Yeah, I don't know if this is a new phenomenon, but in recent years, there's been a huge stickering and kind of flyering campaign, I guess you'd say, around Edinburgh as well, where I live, for communist youth groups and all this kind of stuff. So it's certainly active and visible, unfortunately. Bonnie gives $1. Thank you very much, Bonnie. And then Christian gives €10 and asks, what does Michael think about the video of the anonymous soldier? I'm curious. He is investigated for mutiny, but that seems exaggerated to me. Do you know what Christian's asking about, Michael?
Yeah, look, you're in the middle of a war. In normal circumstances, in most countries, and I believe including in the US, and I think there are laws about this, I'm of course not a lawyer, you're actually not allowed to do that. It's in the middle of a war, you are not permitted to call for essentially mutiny. And it's that simple. This whole notion of flowery free speech, which by the way, if we were talking about blacks or Japanese or any other group, certainly LGBTQ, none of this would continue. If we had the Ku Klux Klan running around, we know what the FDI did about that. We know what happened there. And we know all the rules that were broken when other groups decided they wanted to protest. It's only the anti-Semitic stuff that goes on. Now in Israel, we have this one crazy person, and you have enough people, you're going to have 1, 2 crazy people, of course. And I think I was actually surprised they only kicked him out of the IDF. I personally would have put him in jail. This is not the time to express, free speech doesn't exist completely without limitations during a war. And that's what I would say.
I haven't seen that video, but that sounds interesting. It's something I'll look up after this. Razzie saying in the chat, did they steal the title, The Student Intifada, from us? I don't know if we have quite the sway amongst the pro-Hamas lot as we, I don't know if we would hope to, but as we don't have quite that large a reach as just yet. But certainly what's revealing about that title is that they view the Intifada as a good thing. I didn't see a lot among one of their endorsers, the Electronic Intifada, which is one of these awful publications which publishes the kind of viewpoints that they endorse. But the other one that did endorse them was Mondoweiss, which I think is how you pronounce it, which is the equivalent kind of thing, and is a website which does love, and endorses the people who celebrate 9/11, as you were referring to, Michael. So not only are these people pro-terrorist, which is why I think they're lionizing the term Intifada, and why they're praising martyrs, but there are people there, the terrorist speakers, who are openly anti-Semitic, and yet this conference is, a humanitarian effort. It's, compassionate. It's lovely. All they want is freedom. All this kind of nonsense that gets thrown around, and there's just a real delusion amongst people about what the goals of the Palestinian cause are and what kind of state they'll organize should they get, 1 inch of space to do it. And we all know what it will look like. It'll look like what Hamas has set up in Gaza, which is a miserable, awful little dictatorship. Just before I go to more super chats, Marco and Richard.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what Michael was saying earlier on about the fact that the West, the Western institution, are actually funding these academics, which are the same nobodies that turn up to on these panels. People who've never done a day's work in their life, but they feel like they have enough knowledge to tell you how to live your life, and they have enough knowledge to be able to push this culture, this Islamic culture, onto the Western culture. Effectively, their job is to make the West feel like the Western value of freedom, individual freedom, and liberty are totally passé. And what they're promoting places which have stoning for adultery, and adulterers are placed in the middle of a stadium where people can watch and take part, and they are stoned to death, where beheadings take place, where there is death penalty for blasphemy. If you say Allah is a lot of bullshit, they will come and kill you. Here in the West, you can no longer even make a picture of Muhammad without expecting some bunch of jihadi coming in and shooting you down, you and all your family or whatever. And all this academic, again, they have the facts there. They can just read the news now and then, and they will realize that in Afghanistan, for example, parents sell the young children, the young boys, as dancing boys, as slaves, and who become sexual slaves to some older men in the name of Islam. But We don't talk about it because it doesn't do very good PR for Islam. Meanwhile, the West is terraformed in order to accept this kind of ideology. And it's absolutely ridiculous that most people, as Michael said, do not agree with this. I've never met anyone who said, yeah, you know what, I really would like to be living in Sharia law in, where jihad will decide how my children will live. But it's been pushed, and it's been pushed by these nobodies, these second grade academics who are even afraid of their own shadow. And why are we letting them get away with it? I don't understand.
And all of these terms that they use all the time, whether it's colonialism or imperialism, all of these woolly terms that they hide behind and don't identify what they mean at any point, and use as blanket terms and apply to all different sets of situations simply to hide their own internal contradictions, which exist if you actually analyze why are you for this and why are you against that. And look at the logical inconsistencies in those two positions, for example. All of that is apparent in what they're doing there, and all this trying to tie the unearned prestige of previous movements, whether that's fighting against apartheid in South Africa, for example, or being against the draft for Vietnam, or other things which had legitimacy to the positions, are associated by dropping all the context, treating them all as if they're all the same, and then putting Palestine in the list and treating that as today's version of these other things.
So Jonathan gives $3. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And then PC gives another £5 and says, Palestinians have no history. They did not exist historically. Yes, there's a tremendous kind of argument about who was on the land first and all this kind of nonsense, right? And ultimately, I think the case that we make on the channel is that none of that is really relevant. But because people conceive of the conflict in that way about collective ownership of the land, a homeland, something like that, after 1948, there seems to have been a concerted movement to create a Palestinian national identity when there was nothing like that historically. A lot of the scholars who look at the period prior to 1948 in the 30s and before not only note the obvious, which is that the area we refer to as Palestine or today as Israel, the people who lived there had kind of much more tribal loyalties to villages and towns that they lived in because it was a very kind of disintegrated kind of area. But they certainly didn't conceive of themselves as Palestinians. And the Arab nationalist movement very consciously tried to create this sense of identity and unity among them, as nationalist movements want to do. But given that they only seem to succeed after 1948, the whole notion of a Palestinian identity is formed around hatred of Israel and the desire for its destruction, and then also the use of violent means. Yes, in the 90s, Arafat, tentatively engages in peaceful the peace process with Clinton and in Oslo and all this kind of nonsense. But he doesn't give an inch when he could secure himself a Palestinian state, because his goal wasn't really to get that. It was he didn't want to make any concession towards a two-state solution. And it's notable that at this conference, the two-state solution is not what they're after. When they're referring to Israel as the occupier, they don't mean in Gaza, although people do say that Gaza is occupied, because Israel does not have control over Gaza. They gave it back. They might mean in the West Bank. However, I think very clearly, if you look at their statements, what they mean is the whole existence of Israel is an occupation of all of the land. They want to take it 100%. So to the compromising centrist types who think that the two-state solution is the silver bullet, which is going to bring peace to the region, the people you're supporting don't want that. That's not what they're after. And people, you need to pull your head out of your rectum if you think that that's really going to achieve anything. Michael?
Yeah, just to go back to what Marco and Richard were saying. I've heard this kind of ridiculous argument that these are the people that were supporting, of course we shouldn't be in Vietnam. Certainly you can argue we didn't fight that war properly. We didn't call it a war, and we didn't fight it to win it. We fought it to ultimately to show Russia that we would let our own kids die. And we lost 50,000 plus American soldiers for no reason. I mean, there's no good outcome at all from that. And then you could say apartheid And clearly nobody wanted to have race-based problems. Now you can look at South Africa now and ask the question, and what has happened to that country, not to go back to apartheid, but clearly that is not one of the countries that anyone would hold up as an exemplary country of success. What's remarkable more to me, because at least in Vietnam you could say, well, people shouldn't go fight if we're not going to really fight the war, and we're not even sure what we're really fighting for. And in apartheid, it's pretty easy to say why we were fighting or why people would be supporting getting rid of apartheid. It is unclear to me of any fact that there is anything good about this movement right now. If the problem in Palestine, in Gaza and the West Bank is that the people are oppressed, while Israel doesn't even exist inside of these countries, and in fact, more people used to be employed, more Gazans used to be employed in Israel than were employed in Gaza, unless you work directly for Hamas. That's before October 7th. Guess what? Yes, Israel shut down all employment for all Gazans after war was declared. Big shock, right? But what good has happened since 2006/7 when Hamas took over Gaza? What good has happened in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority since multiple people were so-called running that disaster, which has been a tragedy? And the fact is, if you actually ask people what good has come out of it, other than bringing in a ton of money, because let's face it, they were very effective. The leaders of Hamas and of Palestinian Authority were very effective in getting the world, including the US and certainly Qatar and Western Europe, to donate tons of money to UNRWA and through other places. And we all know where that money went. And let's be very clear that the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel was only as good as the, how many is it now, 100 tunnels that exist now to bring weapons in through Egypt into Rafah. It's 50, I think, in Rafah and another 50 outside of Rafah from the Egyptian border into Israel. This is with a country that Israel has a peace treaty with, that before Rafah actually said publicly they had none of the arms that came into Gaza came in through Egypt. Now, a normal thinking adult would say, well, they didn't come in through Israel, and they couldn't come in through the Mediterranean because that was blockaded by the Israeli Navy to make sure that arms don't come through. So if Israel didn't do it, the only other border is Egypt. It had to come in through Egypt. And lo and behold, we go into Rafah and we find the tunnels. Now, nobody wanted Israel in Rafah. My point is, there is nothing good about Hamas. There is virtually nothing good about Palestinian Authority. And the only chance that any of these people in either of those two places have is to get some semblance of a government that actually is interested in individual flourishing. Now, that is what is so shocking to me about this entire movement. They can't point to an apartheid situation. They cannot point to a halfway fought war, which was a police action, I believe we called it in America, with death, of 50,000 plus, which is way more than we should have seen in a far-off land. And this is the question that the good people have to ask ourselves. What exactly do any of these idiot kids and these two-bit, as you write, second, I would call them fifth-rate professors, have to say about it? What is the good thing? They can call themselves socialists. So play it out for me. What is going to happen? Now, let's assume you get your land. Israel's gone tomorrow. And then who's going to take over and build a country and run a country? And the answer is, it'll end up just like southern Lebanon. It'll end up just like Syria. It'll end up a disaster. And we all know that.
Yes, and on the point you made about UNRWA, in the building in North Gaza where they found the bodies of, I think it was 3 of the hostages, one of whom was Shani. Look, there was this big sign on it, which underneath the UNRWA sign, it said, "We thank Germany or whoever for sending all the money to create this building." So it was money from the European Union, really, that went to fund the building where the tunnel was made, where they hid the bodies of the hostages. So for people who find the idea that Western money is, funding Hamas and is helping the war effort against Israel, if they find that a bit of a difficult thing to digest, there's a real concrete example for you there to see that that money is going to help the terrorists. And that's one of the very good and real reasons why all the funding for UNRWA needs to be completely abolished. Mark and Richard?
Yeah, and the direction is exactly the opposite, where the funding is being restored, despite having all the evidence that suggests that the funds have been and are being misused. And to go back to Michael's point about how did the weapons come in? Well, they never look under the bags of flour and sugar, do they? For obvious reason, UN has got a special status, so they don't go through normal security channels, and they bring in whatever they want. It's the same old story, documented. But hey, let's pretend we want a better world by giving more and more rights to these regime who want to introduce slavery, and let them take place. Let them come across like the moral path here, and Israel is the bad guy for trying to defend its own citizens. But by going back to this conference, I'd like to read a piece from a speech that a guy who was, they said he was in Palestine, wherever that was. It might well have said Mordor, just to come up with another fake country. But he was allegedly in the Middle East. The guy said that the struggle between Hamas and Israel, Hamas is actually part of the Palestinian People Liberation Movement, like all the resistant faction in Gaza, both Islamic and leftist. I mean, now to make the statement and ignoring the fact that most of the people in the kibbutz were actually leftists, it kind of not only ignores the suffering and the fact that lefty people were trying to help people in Gaza were killed by the Gazans themselves, but also makes the point that you lefty should actually help us. It's like, what? I mean, we help you, but then it's like feeding a crocodile, hoping a crocodile doesn't eat you. It's just this kind of disconnect that everybody supporting these people don't realize that the Islamists have got only one interest in their mind, and is to impose Sharia law, Islamic rules, and wipe out every single Jews, as the Quran tells them over and over again. That's the only aim before they move to the rest of the West.
And of course, using the veneer of authority and respectability that many people still assume the UN has, they do it under the banner of that. And I think the same applies when it comes to lots of these charities that are listed that then feed other charities financially or support other charities, other causes that are completely different to what is their stated core aim. So you really have to do your due diligence before considering donating to any given charity, and make sure that they're not suddenly feeding one of these other causes like those I listed earlier. Because I mean, that is rife here. And because one of the things you're seeing is them tying together all sorts of different elements under all of these charities. They include things against police brutality, things in favor of the environment, things for a higher minimum wage, things for more union rights, and of course, at the same time, terrorism against Israel as a side issue at the end there. But you might people are easily led into supporting one of those other causes earlier on, and this particular conference, for example, raised $200,000 in the course of this weekend. And of course, that's a drop in the ocean next to what countries across the world have been giving UNRWA and the UN for decades.
Yes, I think one of the things that's notable about the conference is how little coverage it received, in the sense of negative coverage in the Western media. The only actual media I saw of this that was negative was in the Jerusalem Post, which is in Israel, for goodness sake. The only other ones that I saw were praising it, and these were from left-wing publications. One of them was called Code Pink. I take it that Code Pink is probably a LGBT news website, something like that, unbelievably praising this kind of conference. But in the wake of 9/11 in the in the 2000s, 2010s, when the West was undergoing a much greater frequency of Islamic terror attacks, let's say, there was a recognition domestically, at least here in the UK, I can't speak about other countries, that Islamic groups, various mosques, things like that needed to be monitored to just be aware of what kind of support they were giving, if any, to terrorist groups. I don't know, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, whatever. Because if they were doing that, that was an open threat to the West, given the very real existential attacks or attacks which were attempted to threaten the existential existence of the UK. So they needed to monitor these groups and see what they were doing. Now, with the Palestine conference, there isn't that same recognition that there's a real threat and a worry here. And I know this is the favorite objectivist punching bag, but it's a punching bag for a reason. You need to be aware of it. I think it's because of the appeal to altruism. And for some reason, the appeal to altruism that's made by the Palestinian cause gains it a huge amount of favor, whereas any kind of Al-Qaeda or Taliban appeal to do that doesn't seem to do quite the same thing. Although, interestingly, early in the war, we did see this weird phenomenon on TikTok of young people talking about how much they loved Osama bin Laden's letter to America because it was appealing on altruistic grounds to anti-colonialism, all that kind of stuff. And Rand has a point in one of her Q&As where she's asked about conspiracy theories, and she's very critical about the idea of conspiracy theories typically, and that's for multiple reasons. But one of the things she says is that the real malign forces in the world don't really need to conspire. They often declare and organize and do what they need to do very clearly out in the open, because they're appealing to altruism. There's no kind of secret about what they're doing. They're making their appeal altruistically to you. And again, if you look at just the closing statement from this conference, they're openly talking about how they're oppressed, but they're going to overthrow the evil oppressor. They're going to, fight against US imperialism, all this kind of stuff. So the particular way that altruism is manifesting in the Palestinian movement is to cast the Palestinians as the underdog. And in most people's mind, that's where the thought line seems to stop. So long as they are viewed as being oppressed, then they are in the right and they're the justified party, no matter how much murder, mayhem, blowing up of buildings they engage in. I mean, and even, the West Bank seems to get a lot more kind of public goodwill necessarily than Gaza does, because there's at least some recognition among some people that with Hamas in control of Gaza, Gaza's not the lovely Palestinian state that you want. But I was just looking at the reporting last night of a terrorist attack that was coming to Israel from the West Bank, openly showing some guys dressed in keffiyeh shooting guns at a nearby Israeli building. So because they're making their appeal to altruism, people are completely blinded to the real violence that's going on in these movements. And if you can successfully leverage altruism in that way to cast yourself as the oppressed, you can get away with a huge amount of violence in a way that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban couldn't have done. Clearly, they needed better communications people on their side to leverage that. And then they could have got away with things. Michael?
Yeah, I think just following quickly on Marco and Richard, and I'll get to what you just talked about, Morgan. One suggestion I have for the audience, and I've done this myself. We no longer support any charities that have not affirmed positively with minimal requests, meaning, I'll get my annual renewal notice and I'll write back, we no longer support you until you affirm that you do not support any of the various organizations that support terrorism and so on and so forth. And it is actually shocking the amount of money that we have, quote, saved. We put it elsewhere because these groups are very malign in what they are. Now, most of them will not go and lie in writing, meaning on email, because if they do get caught, they're in deep cock and they probably would lose their charitable status, and there would be, I believe they would be actually criminally liable as well for fraud. But you all should think about that really hard. I stopped giving to my college 5 years ago or 6 years ago when it became that it was clear that BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, was getting a sort of equal time on campus because that represented a group of oppressed people and good things. And of course wasn't racism or anti-Semitism or anything. We've all been there. And most recently, my medical school, the chairman of the DEI department at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and she put it out publicly, so I don't mind repeating it, talked about white supremacy and white privilege. And I got a call the next day from the alumni office, sort of either pretending or not, asking me for money. And I told them what I thought of them and their institution. Now, this woman, of course, apologized, but she still has her job. And if anybody thinks she actually changed her views, they're fools. And I no longer support my medical school, which is a tragedy because Johns Hopkins Hospital and Johns Hopkins Medical School, terrific place. But my point of all this story is that we all need to be very vigilant. This starts in our universities and our high schools, at least in America. America doesn't teach, most of the high schools, public high schools that we looked into, and we looked into a fair number, don't teach the Holocaust anymore. It offends Germans. They barely talk about 9/11, and they talk about it like it was a bunch of, very, very fringe group of people that, happen to be Muslim. But they don't typically use the term Islamic militants or Islamism or anything like that. They don't tell the truth. They are very happy to talk about the American revolutionaries, often in courses, as being traitors to the British government. No offense to you all here in the UK, but even for an American institution to be teaching young kids that the Declaration of Independence was a traitorous document, it doesn't help, and it doesn't make for a better world. I think that's the thing we all have to get together, and I think we need to stop being surprised by any of this. Our institutions, a lot of the ones that we held up and revered, like the UN and so on, are completely corrupt. The International Criminal Court and so on, they're just absurd. And I think we need to move on from that. Morgan, I didn't address your topic, and I have to admit I'm a little off. Can you just remind me? I wanted to make one comment.
I was saying about how because they can make their appeal to altruism, that they can be very effective in disguising the violent means that they're using.
Yeah, that's kind of back, at least the way I look at it. I mean, this notion that somehow you can fix anything by committing suicide. I mean, effectively, that's what intifada leads to, is death. Death of you, death of everybody around you, is take as many people to Allah as possible. And I don't understand how anybody thinks that could work. It never has worked that I know of in history. And by the way, remind people, the kamikazes in the World War II did that to America and to the Allies. They flew planes into Allied ships. Mostly they attacked soldiers. They typically didn't attack civilians. But they ended up with 2 atomic bombs dropped on them. And I personally think that was an appropriate response. If people are willing to give their life for the emperor and fly planes into your ships, kind of like flying planes into buildings, you ought to use whatever force you deem necessary to annihilate them until they capitulate and say, we screwed up, we will change, which is actually what happened in Japan. They actually did change. So I'm with you. This notion of oppressor and oppressed, this notion of colonialism, which is a favorite topic now in the humanities departments, is absurd. It's absurd now. The fact is, if Israel wanted to annihilate Gaza and the West Bank, it would have been done 20 years ago. No problem, piece of cake. We have all the weapons to do that. If the United States wanted to be expansionist the way Russia is, China is, and Iran, by the way, Iran has a huge landmass. They want to be expansionist. We could do it in the United States. We don't do it. There's no country in the US, at least I'm aware of, that we want to take over. We have the best army in the world in the US. We could take over anybody practically, except probably China or Russia. If we wanted to annihilate North Korea, it would be done tomorrow with all their nukes. We don't do it. We are a different kind of people. The Western Europe is a different kind of people. We need to get it straight in our head, what is good and what is evil. And as Ayn Rand said, every side has a good and an evil and a right and a wrong. Right and wrong don't have to be perfect. And good and evil good doesn't have to be perfect to be good. We need to get clarity on this. We need our teachers to be removed and replaced, and we need our leaders to start to understand that Western civilization is a good thing. More people have flourished under it. More people in the world have flourished. And that's what we need to keep pushing, and we need to work hard on the problems that we have.
Yeah, the real thing that surprised me, I guess, amongst all that you said, Michael, was that in the US, in high schools, they're not teaching about the Holocaust anymore. there are many things wrong with the UK. I'm not going to pretend we're all great. But at least one of the good things is that there is a pretty good teaching around the Nazis and World War II and the Holocaust. They taught me for 4 years about that. So it's
just to be clear, I mean, it's not like they're not mentioning, but it's glossed over. My kids went to a 30% Jewish high school, and it was glossed over. I mean, it was sort of a footnote. 6 million Jews were gassed, and also gypsies and homosexuals were also killed. And by the way, 12 million other people died. It's kind of in passing. It wasn't anything about the hate and the industrialization of murder that was done.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tragedy because although it's a difficult area to study in a way, it's very, very important for people to understand what it was that led to the Holocaust and to the Nazis taking power. And if you're really doing your students a disservice, if you're not educating them in that area of history, I really have to think. Mark and Richard?
Yeah, and also how they represent the past and distort the past. I mean, in the course of this conference, I saw Vietnam described as a victory for the Vietnamese people against US colonialism, as if that sums up, what happened. And on your point on altruism, what I find is just staggering is the ability to drop the context for other families and babies that supposedly you should care for as being families and babies, those hostages, the people, rape is not resistance, and what happened on October the 7th. And yet the ability to completely blank that is truly evil, to be honest, because you cannot do that by default. You have to do that at some level of your consciousness, your active consciousness that is there, and you're choosing to evade it. And I find that truly despicable. A lot of what you're seeing in the course of this is a lot of dropping of context, a lot of emphasizing unessential facts and drawing unconnected inferences all the time, and it's unpicking those and understanding the terminology and the logical steps or the logical leaps and lack of steps that have been made that really pulls this apart. But I think towards the end of their closing statement, they produced a phrase aimed at the delegates, the attendees, and any supporters, which I found truly chilling, which was "You serve the world revolution," and that should be a warning to everyone as to how far-reaching this is, how many different organizations it pulls in, and the fact that this is simply one strand of it, and that we need to be actively minded and awake when it comes to noticing these things and speaking up against them.
Yeah, a week today is the anniversary of the D-Day, the landing of the Allies in Normandy, the beginning of the recapture of the removal of the Nazi from mainland Europe. And if some idiots like these guys were arguing at the time, okay, Allies, you're taking the north of France, it's enough, stop occupying. Now they wouldn't have the kind of freedom to say the stupid thing they're saying. And that kind of thinking doesn't apply on the case of Israel. Israel has to be the one who lets the Nazi do what they want and not offend them too much. If the Allies were told, okay, you killed enough Nazis now, stop it because the numbers are scary. Well, would this be a better world? I don't think so. And the same principle applies, but they choose not to do it because their ideologies twist their minds to such an extent that they can't even see in front of their noses.
Yes, and just since we're in the last few minutes, I was saying at the beginning that the real profit of looking at this conference is that you can see the ideas which are pushing forward the conflict, in the background, which will continue going on even once the fighting in Gaza is stopped, and it'll probably end up with another ceasefire declared. But the battle line, so to speak, will continue to be advanced in this manner. It's important for people to realize, I only ever saw just a little bit of this. I didn't go on to do a PhD or whatever. But the academic world is huge. There's really just a whole rabbit warren of conferences and talks and papers that are presented just all the time. And so this is one conference in a microcosm or a macrocosm of other conferences like this, which will be put on. And although this conference had speakers from a wide array of backgrounds, the kind of thing that they're talking about will be spoken at much more kind of limited academic conferences. And the idea is that they're speaking about are directly coming from the universities. And as Michael was saying, it's really important to understand that the universities are the bad guys in the picture here. Now, Rand has a lot to say about that, but I think for a really good exposition of that point, Leonard Peikoff has a talk, which I want to say is called The Assault from the Ivory Tower, The Professor's War on America. And really, you could broaden that to the America's War on the West, where he goes through in detail about why that's happening. And of course, he's looking at that from a broader philosophical perspective, but you could take that kind of broader background and apply it very concretely to the more narrow issues that they're focusing on around the conflict, Israel, Palestine, all that kind of stuff. Because I think the reason why the conflict seems to set the culture on fire whenever the fighting breaks out is because it's a prism through which you see refracted all of those basic philosophical issues, not only altruism, although that's obviously what we focus on a lot of the time, but colonialism, as Michael was saying, racism, of course, gets brought up, all this kind of stuff. So just keep in mind, if anyone was to come away thinking that, oh, this is one conference that's going on, this is one of many. And that's even just speaking about in the context of America. But okay, guys, any parting thoughts before we leave everyone?
Not really. I mean, it's just a depressing example of many, as you say, and of course, one of the things you see in the course of this is that the promotion of social media, how they try and persuade people to use social media as a tool for change, and of course how they're trying to bridge the gap for the students between the fact they're now off on summer break for several months and will forget the cause of Palestine and need to be re-energized, according to these people, in order to create a massive ruckus come the autumn. So, let's hope that fails as well.
Yeah, and also bear in mind that whether they call it global solidarity or not, there's still intifada, there's still terrorism. So don't let these guys get away with just changing the words and doing the same kind of monstrous activity that they've been doing till now.
Any passing thoughts, Michael? Or
yeah, just a challenge to those of you who would perhaps be on the fence about this or think they might have a point. Just give us an example next time of a country that's successfully negotiated things and created a flourishing country for its citizens that took this path, because the path is very clear. And show us an example. I mean, you can also show us an example of successful socialism, but start with the first one. Well,
they always evade about that, don't they? It was never true socialism, and this isn't true Islam, and all this nonsense, right?
Yeah. Good.
But all right, everybody. Thank you very much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. On the Daily Objective, we're talking about the burning of the Israeli embassy in Mexico. And then on the reality show, we're going to be with Chris from South Africa, who's been on the channel before. And we're looking at the South African election. The results are just filtering in. So we'll have a look at that and see what the outcome is for the ANC and what influence that might have on the future of South African politics. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
No.
It's like you're beginning to break up there.
Yeah, you're